Once again, it was weird last week being gone. We were out of town. We were at State Street Church of Christ over in Bristol, and it was just different. Teaching Bible class over there and then preaching over there, it just felt a little bit weird on a Sunday. But nonetheless, we're very much glad to be back. We're glad to have seen so many of you come and be with us during the meeting. Randy and Jill made it out twice, both Monday and Tuesday. We saw the Crutchfield, saw the stairs. Betty Prophet came out, the Wasps were there. I know I've missed a couple of you. We remember you were there. The Lamberts were there. We saw y'all. We very much appreciate you being there. Thank you so much for your support. It's wonderful, though, to be back and be home. We'll be in Daniel chapter 5 this morning, and I'll make a quick announcement before we get started. This Saturday, a couple of us are going to go out and go door knocking. We'll meet here at the building sometime around 10 o'clock, and we'll make another announcement Wednesday night. I'll have tracts ready to go, and we'll go out for a couple of hours and then maybe grab lunch or something at about noon. And I'll probably call it quits at that. If people want to continue going after that, that's fine. But I'll go for about 2 hours, and we'll start here maybe about 10 o'clock Saturday morning. And hopefully we can talk to some people and make progress there. We're in Daniel chapter 5, and the lesson's title is Principles from the Palace. As the scripture reading had said, there was a king, his name was Belshazzar, and this was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, his grandson. The text is going to call him a son, and he's going to at times refer to Nebuchadnezzar as his father. It's common in biblical literature for a son or a grandson to refer to the descendant as father, and they don't need to say great-great-grandfather. They get the idea. And so in chapter 5, verse 1, we're immediately introduced to this Belshazzar who hosts this great feast. And he says in verse 2 that he was the son and his father was Nebuchadnezzar. And so we immediately have to ask our question of who was Nebuchadnezzar? Well, Nebuchadnezzar was this great military general. He was a great leader of the Babylonian army. And Nebuchadnezzar in 612 really defeated Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, and he took the battle. He took the day. Later in 604 BC, his father would crown him as king over the Babylonian Empire. And it's at this point that this really starts to develop, and they start to be the lords of the lands. The Babylonians rule the day. And so Nebuchadnezzar was a renowned person of history, of antiquity. The people, when they heard Nebuchadnezzar, they thought of a leader, they thought of the king, they thought of the most important and most powerful man in the land. Well, Belshazzar comes along a few years later, about 50, 60 years later. And how should he establish a kingship? By linking himself to somebody who's been great before. I teach hermeneutics right now on Thursdays at the preaching school. And I was talking to Luke and Denver. Denver's not in that class. Sorry, Denver. Luke and Dustin and Robbie, another one of the students. And I was telling them how when Barack Obama took office, in his inauguration speech, if you pay very close attention, he uses a couple of phrases in that speech where he links linguistically his rhetoric to two other people in history. Abraham Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address. And then also he links it to a speech that Martin Luther King gave. And we don't even pick up on those things typically. But when we start to pay attention to his rhetoric and we start to hear Barack Obama is linking himself back to Lincoln, he's linking himself back to Martin Luther King, we start to realize what he's doing. He's trying to put himself in the lot with these other great men of history. Well, Belshazzar does the same thing. He is the son of Nebuchadnezzar, this great leader before him. And so he wants to try to link himself with this other king as great as possible. Well, what did Nebuchadnezzar do? In 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25, we have a narrative that runs there for us, where Nebuchadnezzar the king comes into the land of Jerusalem and in 586 BC flattens the temple, flattens the city walls, and grabs a hold of all of those vessels, all of those ornaments, and allegedly the Ark of the Covenant, and rips them out of the house of the Lord. It's in this reading that Belshazzar grabs a hold of these vessels that had been carried back to Babylon. And look at what he does with them. Let's read the text again. In 5 and verse 2, he commands to bring the golden, the silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem. And he says, bring those things forward, that the king, the princes, the wives, the concubines, all of the nobles of the land might drink therein. And see, this wasn't a real problem, was it? See, there's nothing on this planet. There's really nothing on this planet that is within itself sacred. This book is, I understand what it contains, but nonetheless, it's just a Bible. It's just pages. It's just materials. I understand that the church building is where we assemble to worship God, but there's nothing about this building that in and of itself is sacred. The pieces that were used to construct this building were just wood, just sheetrock, just lights. They're just fixtures. They're just furniture. But there was something about the pieces of furniture that Belshazzar got a hold of. They weren't sacred pieces in and of themselves, but they were God's pieces. They were God's elements. And when he started to disgrace them, God took this personally. He said, you're not just disgracing these elements anymore. There's something more behind this. And what he's doing is a direct attack on the God that you and I serve. In Daniel chapter 5, look what he does in 3. It says that when they brought the golden vessels that were taken of the temple, he brought the king, his princes, his wives, all of them, and they drank in them. And in verse 4 it says they drank wine. I'm sure that's alcohol. I am sure that's intoxicating wine. And then it goes on and it says, and they praised the gods of gold. They're polytheists. They worship idols. And then it goes on and it says of silver, brass, iron, wood, stone. Some of the background reading that I've done for this chapter lets me know this is not just an idol worship ceremony in and of itself. They're actually having a sexual orgy right there in the midst of God, using His vessels to do the thing. And this is intended. They're wanting to take a stab at your God and at my God. And see, Belshazzar thinks nothing of it, but what he thinks is if I can disgrace Jehovah God before these other individuals that we've made captives, and if I can disgrace Him, I can let the people of the land know exactly how powerful and how mighty I am. And so in chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, we start to learn that some glasses are gods. And that's point 1. Sometimes we've just got to learn that some of the glasses are gods. Nothing wrong with the glasses in and of themselves being drunk by these Babylonian lords. But it was wrong in that they were doing it as a sign of disgrace unto the God that really lives. There's another case where something similar to this happens. Take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 4, where the people, they've been living wickedly. Eli is the priest, and he's got 2 sons who really are, the text just comes out and says they're sons of wickedness, sons of Belial. And in 1 Samuel chapter 4, the Philistines are moving in. The army's getting close. And so what are we going to do? Well, a righteous man would say it's time for me to hit my knees in prayer. A righteous man would say it's time for me to lift holy hands to God. Well, not these people. Not Eli, not Hophni, not Phinehas. Instead, in 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 3, it says, when the people were coming to the camp, the elders of Israel said, let us fetch the Ark of the Covenant. Let's bring out the golden box. As if God, we can go ahead and place no faith in Him throughout the week, and when Sunday comes around, we'll place our faith in Him. My, what a mistake. Well, surely enough, that golden box isn't going to save them without the faith, without the one behind the box. And in 1 Samuel chapter 4, the Ark of God is taken. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, God lets them know His vessels are only to be sanctified as His vessels in their midst when they've placed their faith in the one behind the vessels. Moses makes the same mistake, puts his faith in the rod and smites that rock. He should have been placing his faith not in the rod, but in the one behind the rod. And the same is with you, the same is with me. Our faith cannot be in these things that we see, but it's got to be beyond. It's got to be in God. It's got to be in the one behind what we see working in our present situation. Belshazzar, not only did he not place his faith in the one, he came right out and disrespected him. And so we move into the text in chapter 5, Daniel chapter 5, and we see in verses 4 through 9 another reading here of what happens. Is God going to let this guy get away with what he's done? Is He going to let Belshazzar continue to have his say? Well, in chapter 5 and verse 5 it says, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that he wrote. And some have said, well, maybe he was just so drunk that he imagined all of this. Probably not, especially considering that the lords of the palace later on see this and even call it to their attention. Maybe not, since the Daniel's able to come in later and interpret the text. It's not just something that he saw in some drunken rage or stupor. In Daniel chapter 5, the text goes on in verse 6, the king's countenance was changed. Here is the arrogant man who's lifted himself up, and he's been saying, I'm the boss. I'm going to let the world know that I'm the boss. All of a sudden, buckling at the knees. And you can imagine him standing there as out of the side of the wall comes forth you might imagine a ghastly kind of thing. And the candlesticks that is in the original language here, these are things that were placed along the sides of the wall. And imagine a palace of this size that has these torches, candles, every so often. It's dimly lit. It's a stone palace, you can imagine. And then out of the wall comes forth this ghastly hand and immediately starts to write. Boy, wouldn't that change your view of things? Wouldn't that change the way you're looking at things? And so in Daniel chapter 5, the hand comes out and it writes something. We don't know what it says yet. But in Daniel chapter 5, the hand writes. The king buckles at the knees. And in verse 6 it says, his joints of his knees were loosed. His knees smote one against another. The king cried aloud, verse 7. And he calls in the experts. Let's get in the intellectuals of the day. We've got to find out what this is meaning. We've got to find out what's going on. And sadly to say, none of the experts could help. And in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 8, all the king's men came in. They couldn't read the writing. They couldn't make known to the king the interpretation thereof. And King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. In his countenance it changed, and his lords, they were also astonished. What we start to find here, some sayings are serious. And there's your second point. A second principle that we can take away from the palace is that some sayings are serious. See, sometimes we shirk off these things and people talk about end of the world kind of stuff and we shove it away and we say that's not really going to happen. Or we talk about the second coming of Christ and we talk about a day when we're going to be judged according to our works and we push that away from us. I don't like to think about that. How many people do you know personally that really don't like to think about that day and hour? How many people do you know that really just sit in the pews and don't really give it a whole lot of thought? People that attend church day in and day out, but they really don't think about the seriousness of the thing. Well, Belshazzar's that kind of guy. The hand comes out, and for the first time in his life, as this hand comes out of the wall, he is being forced to think about these things in a serious way. Crises happen to us all. But wouldn't it be good if we had to think about God, if we thought about God and we thought about the things He demands before He forces us to? Wouldn't it be good if the God that we serve deserved our attention long before it took a crisis to bring us to that point? See, it's great while we're 12. When we're 12, we're interested in playing ball and we're interested in hanging out with our friends. And then we get to be 18 and we do some of those same things. And then we go off to college and we think about school and we think about finding a job. And then we turn to be about 50 and some of us are still trying to go on the same endeavors. Some of us never grow up, you see. But there has to come a point, and wouldn't it be good if we found that point earlier, where we thought about these things before a tragedy struck? Wouldn't it be good if we thought about God and what He demands long before? And we started remembering our Creator in the days of our youth, Ecclesiastes 12:1. Wouldn't it be good if Belshazzar had thought of these things long before this event? See, Belshazzar is going to cry out, and he brings in the diviners and the intellects. But he does it in a moment of crisis. There's a passage, it's dark. It's a dark passage. But look at this one. Look at Proverbs 1, and look at what our God has said about wisdom. We don't like to think about God in this way. We like to think about God as our Savior. We like to think about God as the one who only offers good. And He's the one that we'll rely on when things do get bad. But sadly, like Belshazzar, like those Israelites that put their trust in only a box, sometimes we fail to put our trust where it should be, and when the crisis strikes, God's not going to be there for us. Look at Proverbs 1:24 through 26. It says, "Because I've called and you refused, I've stretched out my hand and no man regarded. You've set at naught at all my counsel, and would none of my reproof." You wouldn't have any of my reproof is what the text means. And in verse 26, God says, through wisdom speaking, "I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh." That's not the kind of God we like to serve. We like to serve the God who's going to be there for us in the calamity. We like to serve the God who's going to be there for us in the crisis. But God lets us know there's a need then that we put our trust in Him before the crisis strikes. God doesn't want us to look at Him as some last resort. He's got to be our first resort. Belshazzar hasn't done this thing. And he's failed to recognize that some sayings are more serious than others. Whatever this inscription says on the wall, whatever this hand writes, he hadn't given any of that any much thought until this hand wrote it for him. And at this point, it's a little too late, we're going to see. Jump back to Daniel chapter 5 and think about this while you're turning there. What are the sayings that are serious for us today? Probably the plan of salvation. Probably the fact that we've got to worship God in a way that pleases Him. Probably the sayings that say we've got to teach our children how to serve God and how to love God. These are the kinds of sayings we need to be instilling in the next generation. But sadly, too many people don't give this any thought. We just push it from us. And that's what Belshazzar's done. He's pushed it from him. But now the day of reckoning is at hand, and God's going to bring these things to His attention whether He wants them to be brought or not. There was another man before him, as we're going to see, Nebuchadnezzar, who God forced him to have a day of reckoning as well. And lo and behold, Nebuchadnezzar hearkened unto the words of God. He humbled himself and came back to God. Belshazzar's a little differently, as we'll see. Take a look at verses 10 through 16. Now the queen. Who's the queen? It seems to me, and we can't say for sure, that this is probably, though, Belshazzar's mother. It could have been a wife, though she remembers Daniel, who was years before. So she's an older woman. So it's probably either Nebuchadnezzar's wife or even Nabonidus' wife. One of those kings. It was probably the wife, the queen. And she was probably a mother or even a mother-in-law somehow to Belshazzar. Well, she came into the palace after this hand had written what it had on the wall. And in Daniel chapter 5, verse 10, she comes into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Don't let your thoughts trouble thee. Don't let your countenance be changed. Well, that's easy for you to say. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one who's had this writing come out, and you didn't see the ghastly hand. You didn't see this come to you. But the queen has something else that backs up why she can be so calm in this matter. And she says in 5:11, There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, it was found in him, whom the king, Nebuchadnezzar thy father, whom you so badly want to be linked to, even he, the king, I say thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. Verse 12 goes on and says, He had an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting of dreams, showing of hard sentences, dissolving of doubts. And they were found in this same man named Daniel. And it says, Now bring Daniel and let him be called, and he'll show thee the interpretation. Well, why is Daniel not in the court to begin with? Can't quite say. Maybe it's because he took such a hard stance for one God, Jehovah God. And the polytheists didn't like him there, so they cut him out of the camp. Maybe it was the case that Nabonidus and Belshazzar, the two that were reigning co-regent style at this time, maybe it was the case that Nabonidus and Belshazzar were sick of his theology. They didn't like his teaching about God. They didn't like his teaching about rejecting the king's meat and the king's wine. Maybe it was the case that they said, We're not going to have you in our court. Go, get you your own little village somewhere. And they kicked him out of the court. Why wasn't Daniel in the midst? He had been in the midst of the court in Nebuchadnezzar's day. He had risen to the top. Well, all of a sudden, for whatever reason, Daniel's not in the court, but now the king needs him. Now the king needs the righteous man. And so as a last resort, he says, let's get Daniel. The queen comes up with this plot. Bring in Daniel. Bring in the man who's the man of God. He can tell you these things. And you remember sometimes, we think back to 2 Kings 5, where there was that captain of the Syrian host, Naaman, and he got leprosy. He was ready to die. And oh, to God that there would be a man of God. The prophet would come down and cure me of this. See, sometimes it takes the crisis for people to realize they need the man of God. You know what that means? That means that you and I better be prepared as Christians to be that man of God. Sometimes we're the only thing people have. We're the closest thing to a Bible that people will ever read. And so what will people say when they hit their crisis and they say, Oh, if I only had a person of God here to help me through this. Could that be you? Could that be me? If not, we've got to make a rearrangement. We've got to get on track. We've got to be the person who can help them out. Well, Daniel is that kind of guy. And take a look at Daniel 5 and verse 13. Now Belshazzar, he hears this kind of thing from the queen. And Daniel was brought in before the king, verse 13 says. And so the king spake and said unto Daniel, Are you Daniel? Are you the child of the captivity of Judah, that my father brought out of Judea, or Jewry, the King James Version says? I have heard about you, verse 14. I've heard that the Spirit of God is in you. Verse 15, the wise men, the astrologers, they've been brought in. They can't tell me the writing. Maybe you can. Maybe you can help me out. Well, in verse 16, the text says, I've heard of you. You can make interpretations. And then he promises him this, the end of verse 16. If you can do this, if you can tell me what's going on with this writing, this inscription, I'll make you the third king. I'll make you the third ruler. We'll place a gold chain upon your neck. We'll make you ruler in the kingdom. We'll give you a clothing of scarlet. You'll look like a leader of the land. What do you think Daniel's going to do? Well, Daniel rightfully knows where his power lies. Daniel, quite unlike Belshazzar, quite unlike Moses in that moment of failure at the rock, quite unlike those Philistines the Israelites who put their trust only in this golden box, the Ark of the Covenant, Daniel knows who lies behind his ability. Daniel knows who's behind his ability to tell the dreams, the visions, the interpretations. And Daniel doesn't care one whit about being third in the land. And the reason for that is he knows who's number one in the land, and it's not Belshazzar. It's Jehovah God. In Daniel chapter 5, we learn a third thing from chapter 5, verses 10 through 16, and that's that righteousness is remembered. Who did the queen think of? Billy. No, not Billy. Johnny. No, Johnny wasn't called in. Those would be some strange Babylonian names, wouldn't they? But they called Daniel. They called the man who had been known for being a righteous person. Don't sell yourself short, Christian. In the moment of somebody's crisis, it's probably going to be you, if you've lived rightly, that they'll remember. Your name will go down not in history, but your name will go down in the book of life because you've lived and you've served God faithfully. That's where Daniel's name is. And the people remember him not only because of the dreams, they remember him because of his righteousness. And that's why Daniel was able to work with the dreams in the way he was. And our third point then is we remember righteousness is remembered. We move now into verse 17. Daniel's going to have a response. Now put yourself in the shoes of this king, and he's got all of his leaders situated around him. And you can imagine the court is filled with the elites of the land. You call for this guy who, in your view of things, is lesser than you. Let's bring him in, and we'll have Daniel the servant tell us the meaning of this inscription. Well, Daniel comes in, and what do you think you would expect as a king? I'm not asking for financial advice. I'm not asking for you to repair my horse and buggy. I'm simply wanting to know the meaning of this inscription. If you can tell that, tell it. If not, go on your way, Daniel. Well, Daniel does something that a lower man, a slave, a servant, would never do. He starts to lecture the king. And he's going to tell the king a thing or two. Oh my. Look at this. In verse 17, Daniel answered, Keep your gifts. Give your rewards to another. Daniel's not in it for the reward. I'll read the writing unto the king. I'll make known unto him the interpretation. But in verse 18, before he does that, he says, I'm going to remind you of some things. The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom. It was this one, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And he says in verse 19, and the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, languages, everybody in the land trembled. They feared him. They looked at him as the boss. And he goes on in verse 19, if he wanted somebody slain, they killed him. If he wanted somebody to live, they made sure that that man stayed alive. But in verse 20, the text says, but when his heart was lifted up, his mind hardened in pride, Nebuchadnezzar was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Nebuchadnezzar, the boss, lost his power. He lost his seat. He lost his throne. Why? He elevated himself beyond God. He elevated himself and started saying, look what I've done. Look at what I can do. Move on in verse 22 and look at what's stated. Verse 21, he was driven from the sons of men, cast out like a beast of the field, until he knew, the end of verse 21 says, until he knew that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and that he appoints it to whomsoever he will. Okay. I'm just wanting to know the interpretation of the dream. I don't really care about a history lesson here, Daniel. That's surely what the king was thinking. He doesn't care about reminiscing on Nebuchadnezzar's past. Oh, but earlier on he wanted to be linked to Nebuchadnezzar. Earlier on, that's the man he wanted to be like. And now his history is being brought back to him, as Daniel reminds him exactly what his father did. It wasn't just that his father took the city of Jerusalem, took the vessels and brought them back to Babylon. There was more there than just that. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled through judgment by God. And so Daniel says this in 523, you, Belshazzar, have not lifted yourself up. You have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They've brought the vessels of his house. You, your lords, your wives, your concubines, you've drunk in them. You've not praised God, but you've praised the gods of silver, wood, iron, stone. And in 524, he says, then this was the part of the hand sent from him. And here is what the writing said. Look back at 23, the end of it. The end of verse 23 says, in all of this, the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose all your ways, and they reside in him, you've not glorified him. Daniel gives him a speech, gives him a lecture. And we start to remind ourselves then that here's a man who is remembered for righteousness. And our fourth point is then we see Daniel's rejection of the reward. He doesn't care about obtaining this necklace. He doesn't care about being third in the land. He doesn't care about a scarlet robe. He cares about telling the king what the king really needs to hear. Wouldn't that be good if Christians today were like that? If we didn't necessarily care about the politics and we didn't necessarily care about keeping friends so much as we cared about getting truth on the table. Look, I don't have better friends than the people who shoot straight with me. And you don't either. You respect, most importantly, the people in your lives who will tell you when you're wrong and also affirm when you're right. You love the people, really, even though sometimes you really get to hate them. You really love the people who shoot straight with you and tell you what you need to hear. They make you better people. Daniel's that kind of man. That's respectable. He's a man telling the king what he needs to hear. And so he says, away with the reward. I don't care about that. I'm going to put on the table what you need to hear. And in 525, the inscription comes to us. And now what we recognize, lastly, point number 5, is we start to recognize the interpretation of the inscription. The writing said this, and these are Aramaic words, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. That makes a lot of sense to us, right? Made a lot of sense to the Babylonians too, right? They couldn't read it either. It's probably the case that Daniel was brought in not necessarily to read this miraculously, but simply because it was a language that the Babylonians couldn't understand. Maybe it was just an Aramaic dialect that they weren't familiar with. Maybe it was the case that he read it miraculously and God inspired him to do the thing. Can't quite say. But in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 25, the text reads this way, and Daniel, the man who can interpret, the man who can dissolve these doubts, tells us what it means. He says in verse 26, Mene means God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Well, that's uplifting. Don't you always want a doctor to come into the room and the first thing he says is, oh, by the way, this doesn't look good? That's what Daniel does. He shows up in the king's court and he says, well, it doesn't look good. God just told you your kingdom's been numbered and finished. The second thing says in verse 27, Tekel, which means you've been weighed. God's, as it were, taken Belshazzar, set him on the scales, and you've been lacking. And God says, because we've weighed you in such a way, in such a manner, judgment is moving in. Okay, we've gotten the two pieces of bad news out of the way. Let's hear the good news, Doc. And then in verse 28, he uses the word Perez, which is another form. It's a play on words of the word Upharsin. You might realize that the word has changed from verse 25. Daniel's using wordplay. And he uses a word that involves the nation of the Persians. And he says, the Medes and the Persians are moving in. Your kingdom has been divided and given to it. 3 pieces of bad news. There's not a positive thing there for the patient to hear. And Belshazzar, what does he do? Most honorable thing we can say of Belshazzar, he was true to his word. Look at this, in verse 29, then commanded Belshazzar, they put Daniel with scarlet, put a chain about his neck, made him third ruler in the kingdom. There's no stock there. There's nothing here. Daniel's just told him his kingdom's going to be taken and given to another. What do you think Daniel's going to do when Cyrus the Great moves in? Tell him, oh, by the way, I'm third? Not going to happen. What do you think we're going to do when we try to say to God, God, I'm supposed to be boss. I'm supposed to be the top dog. Daniel knows the line of things. See, this last section of chapter 5 teaches us about the need for an interpretation of the inscription. There is nothing more important in your life and mine than the correct interpretation of Scripture. Friends, excel in sports. Excel in academics. Excel in politics. Excel in whatever you want. But in the final day, the Lord's not going to care where you stand on those things. The Lord is simply going to care with where you stand in relation to the text that He's given us. What more can I say? This morning, if you're not a child of God, there is nothing more important in your life than making sure God has His say, than making sure that God is top, than making sure that God rules your life, and that we're not just second in the kingdom. We're wherever that puts us, we're beneath God. We've got to make sure that God has His say and that we've done things His way. Look at the text and see what it is that God tells us in order to become a child of His. My Bible reads, your Bible reads in the New Testament. The one must hear the words that Christ taught. John 12:48, John 6:44 and 45, Romans 10:17, and a host of other passages. Know the text. Know what God expects of you. But don't stop there. Move forward. Put your faith in Him as the risen Lord. Proofs all over for this kind of thing. John 8:24 and other passages attest to that. And the secular historians, they document it for us as well. Confess Him as Lord, Romans 10:9 and 10. Turn away from a wicked way. Turn away from a wicked life. Repent of it, Acts 17:30 and 31. And be immersed into Christ, casting off the cares of the world and walking with the Savior in light, Romans 6:3-7. If you're not a child of God, there's not a better time than to become one than right now. If you are a child of God and you've heard, you've walked away, you've not put God first, whatever your needs may be, won't you come forward while we stand and